Good evening and welcome to the American Academy. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Barry Eichengreen, who will present the Kurt Viermetz lecture on the topic, The Populist Turn in American Politics. The phenomenal turnout, if you look around tonight, testifies to the relevance to Europe of the post-election political climate in the US, especially from the point of view of our distinguished visitor Barry Eichengreen, who's well known to a German audience not only through his many books, but also and especially through the many interviews he gives on national German newspapers or to national German newspapers. Tonight's Viermetz lecture is named after the founding trustee of the American Academy, Kurt Viermetz, one of the great figures in international finance, who was 77 when he passed away 2 weeks ago. Kurt Viermetz's interest in economics and public policy culminated in this lecture series, and he was particularly interested in having Barry Eichengreen speak at the American Academy, which he supported both financially and intellectually. We are very happy to have a number of guests here tonight who helped to make this distinguished visitorship in honor of Kurt Viermetz possible. Thank you again for your most generous contributions. Now, our eminent scholar tonight, Barry Eichengreen, is Professor of Economics and Political Science at Berkeley in California. He has a PhD in economics from Yale, as well as an MA in history, and was the president of the Economic History Association. Barry Eichengreen is on the International Advisory Board of the Institut für Weltwirtschaft in Kiel, and since 1997 he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is a top global advisor and the author of at least, I know I'm not supposed to be saying this, but of at least 20 books, last time I counted, on political economics and economic history, always with a view to an in-depth analysis of the factors that make systems work or fail. Because Barry Eichengreen writes about financial crises and what to do about them. He writes about a political architecture for Europe and what stability means in this context. And he writes about global imbalances and the uses and misuses of history, especially in the context of an economic analysis of a post-crisis world. The English journal The Economist lists Barry Eichengreen as one of economics' most influential people on a global scale. Now, tonight, Barry Eichengreen will talk about the populist turn in American politics. You, Barry, I understand, will take questions after the talk, for which we are very grateful. And the evening will then be concluded by a reception over there. Now it is our exorbitant privilege, if I may quote one title of one of your books, to have you here tonight and to give this not only interesting and stimulating but relevant talk tonight on the populist turn in American politics. Ladies and gentlemen, Barry Eichengreen.
Thank you to the American Academy for hosting me and for the kind of invitation. I'm gratified as well by the large turnout which I ascribe to the topic and the times and not necessarily to the speaker. I think it testifies to the fact that there are still two places where people are deeply concerned about current political trends, Germany and California. We are still, all of us, trying to process the implications of the recent election in the US, and I certainly include myself in that collective we. This was a complicated election and an outcome that we're only beginning to try to understand. When I try to begin to understand something as an economist, I turn back to the role of economic factors. So let me start there. I would argue, you will have heard this argument before, but I think it still contains more than a grain of truth, that economic inequality and exclusion dominated electoral politics in the United States in 2016, we can be confident that they will dominate electoral politics again in 2017. So the context and the country will change from the Brexit referendum and the US presidential campaign to support from Marine Le Pen's far-right National Front in the French elections that are coming, prospects for the Five-Star Movement in the Italian elections that are undoubtedly coming, the rise of the anti-immigrant Democratic Party in Sweden. These are each distinctive parties and movements, but I would argue that the taproot of support for each of these anti-system, anti-globalization, anti-immigrant movements is in each case fundamentally the same. The common denominator being the sense on the part of a growing segment of society of being left behind. People see their wages stagnating. They see their jobs growing less secure. Rising inequality suggests to them that this is not only an economic problem, but it also has a political dimension. It's a political problem insofar as that income growth as accrues disproportionately to the wealthy, what we in the United States refer to as the 1%. It's unclear, even to economists, certainly to economists, whether to blame technology or trade or immigration, but there is the widespread tendency to blame all three and to vent one's anger by voting against establishment politicians that have failed to temper the effects. Relatedly, there's the feeling that society and the government through which its constituents make their preferences felt has lost control of these processes. Government has lost control of the nation's borders, allowing immigration to run wild. It's lost the ability to guarantee national and personal security, where fear of terrorism merges in popular and political discourse both with fear of immigration. Government has lost control of the capacity to create good manufacturing jobs, permitting to China to capture them by negotiating unfair trade deals and manipulating its currency. I think the resonance of Trump's promise to build a wall to deter illegal immigration from Mexico is a clear manifestation of this perception of loss of control, as is the argument for Brexit, in order to regain control of Britain's economic and political destiny from the so-called faceless bureaucrats in Brussels. Finally, there's the feeling that those in charge have allowed the erosion of the collective institutions through which earlier economic and social challenges were met. In the United States, this means the decline of trade union membership, which weakened an institution through which workers were able to press for a fair share of corporate revenues and security of employment. Deregulation, supported by politicians, not incidentally receiving corporate campaign contributions, allowed pharmaceutical firms, health insurers, other large companies to charge their customers what they wished, or at least considerably more. Local communities have grown more diverse, and as a consequence lost their sense of collective solidarity. They therefore provide less support, psychological and financial, both to their disadvantaged members. All of this leaves voters with a helpless sense that outcomes are determined not by the decisions and actions of their communities or their governments, but by forces beyond their borders and beyond their control. So that's my starting point for thinking about the new populism, perhaps because I also do economic history, which immediately points to the observation that this new populism bears more than a passing resemblance to the old populism of the 19th century in the United States. Back then, you may recall, populist rhetoric singled out rapacious moneylenders and monopolistic railways as exploiting hardworking farmers who were powerless in the face of high interest rates and ruinous shipping costs. Modern analyses by economic historians lay more weight on commercialization as exposing the farmer to market forces beyond his control. Produce that had once been sold locally was now priced globally, subjecting even the most hardworking farmer to international market forces that he didn't understand. The income to a Midwestern American farmer raising wheat in Nebraska, now by the late 19th century, depended on yields in the barley fields of Ukraine. The price of Sea Island cotton was now affected by events in the Nile Basin. The reality, I think, is that interest rates and freight rates played only a subsidiary role in the farmers' difficulties, but it was easier to blame the railway and the bank, which had a physical presence, in the same way that it may be easier in the present context to blame immigrants than it was back then to blame invisible Egyptian cotton and Ukrainian wheat growers. And it was, of course, easy to blame a government unable to do anything about the problem. The populist revolt in the 19th century, of course, involved more than simply agrarian unrest. If you recall your American storybooks, C. Frank Baum's Wizard of Oz, that was, of course, a book about the populist revolt. The scarecrow standing in for the farmer had as his steadfast companion the Tin Woodman, the industrial worker. In other words, struggling to cope with a radically changed industrial environment. The late 19th century was also the heyday of the Knights of Labor, fundamentally the first nationwide labor organization in the United States, which was fundamentally a creature of the 1880s. Its growth was more evidence of the sense, this time on the part of workers, that they were unable to do anything to affect their circumstances, acting alone. The late 19th century, was also a period when the share of income going to the top 1% was rising sharply. So if you recall your Tocqueville, you will remember that Tocqueville famously described the United States in 1851 as, quote, more equal than any other country of the world in any age of which history has preserved remembrance. Now, in the late 19th century, the US economy had come to be dominated by a handful of so-called robber barons, the Carnegies, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, who accumulated vast fortunes through new technologies utilized by mega corporations that operated unrestrained by progressive taxation, competition policy, or other regulation. The robber barons were resented for their wealth, but I think equally importantly, they were resented for their political influence as the elites, for how, to quote the influential American historian T.J. Stiles, quote, they held sway over a helpless democracy. In these circumstances, then, insecurity and the sense on the part of workers that they were not receiving their fair share of a growing industrial pie manifested itself in support for anti-system political candidates and parties. And in response, the Populist Party was formed in 1891. It was supported by Southern cotton growers and Midwest wheat farmers, but the agrarian interests in question were also allied with labor unions and advocates of free silver coinage from Western mining states. That coalition then attracted nearly 10% of the vote in the US presidential election in 1892, and it led in 1896 to the populists fusing with the Democrats, nominating William Jennings Bryan, the Cowardly Lion being another one of those candidates from another one of those characters from The Wizard of Oz. Brian ran on a platform of free silver, that is, as an opponent of deflation and as a champion of the wage earner, the storekeeper, and the farmer. It's important to recall that there was also a racialist strand in the positions of populist politicians, Southern populist politicians like Thomas Butler of Georgia, who the Populist Party nominated for president in 1904, who attempted to appeal to a constituency of white Southern farmers who had not shared in the prosperity of the period, insinuating that they should blame the other, their black neighbors, for their plight. That same sense of insecurity and exclusion also manifested itself in anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. If wages were stagnating, if men of Scots-Irish descent found themselves competing for jobs with more recent immigrants from Eastern Europe and Asia, then it was tempting to blame immigration for all that was wrong with the world. In 1882, President Chester Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring all immigrants, all immigration of Chinese laborers into the United States in response to this political pressure. In 1907, the US government pressured Japan to essentially prohibit the issuance of passports for Japanese citizens seeking to work in the United States. Even at a century's distance, it's hard to disentangle, I think, the roles of nativism, xenophobia, and economic strains in the development of these restrictive immigration policies, but it's safe to conclude that all three factors were bound up together, all three factors were involved. Bryan was defeated, as you will recall, in 1896. But importantly, there was a positive response to the complaints of the populists. I think already in the 1880s, mainstream politicians, or at least some of them, understood that they had to address the concerns of farmers, miners, and workers, or risk losing out to more radical alternatives. Their response took the form of immigration restriction, as I've described, but it also included, more positively, the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, which required railroad rates to be, quote, reasonable and just. Also in the 1880s, a majority of US states adopted usury laws that placed a ceiling on the socially permissible level of interest rates, or where they already had usury laws, they began to enforce them more strictly. The one place where it was hard for the populists to make progress was in terms of monetary policy. The financial interests opposed to the free coinage of silver were too powerful to overcome. But even there, I would argue, the populist critique did register. It convinced even supporters of the gold standard, the monetary standard in place at the time, that the monetary system, if it was to survive politically, had to be reformed, and the result there was the appointment of a national monetary commission to investigate alternatives short after the turn of the century, and then the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 to provide an elastic currency, in other words, a currency, a set of monetary arrangements that were more responsive to the needs of the economy. So this was still far from a comprehensive response to the populists' grievances, but it did indicate that mainstream politicians were listening, and it was enough in the end to contain the third-party threat. US entry into World War I interrupted business as usual, of course, but only temporarily. National security concerns were invoked this time in support of the 1917 Immigration Act, which imposed a literacy test for immigrants. How literacy and national security were connected is interesting to ponder, but the 1917 Act, quote, barred anarchists or persons who believe in or advocate the overthrow by force or violence of the government of the United States, end quote. And then came the Immigration Act of 1924, which put in place permanent quotas based on the national origin of the US population. Based on the national origin of the US population way back in 1890, when the wave of new immigration from Eastern Europe and elsewhere was only really getting underway. Nativism in this period also found reflection in the Ku Klux Klan, membership in which peaked, in fact, in the 1920s. The 1920s Klan attacked immigrants, Catholics, and Jews as much as Black Americans. It deplored criminality, immorality, non-Protestant values. The 1920s Klan was more urban, more northern, more Western than its 19th century predecessor. Membership responded to the desire of lower and middle-class white workers to protect their economic status from encroachment by migrants from Eastern Europe and the rural South. Many members were drawn, in the words of the historian of the Klan, Leonard Moore, from, quote, a backward segment of American society, one trapped by economic insecurity, dying small-town ways, and an inability to adjust psychologically to the modern age. The Klan appears to have acted as a kind of interest group for the average white Protestant who believed that his values should remain dominant in an America increasingly populated by other groups. Klan members won political office in the 1920s, not only in the South, but in Indiana, in Colorado, in Oregon. Membership grew to something on the order of 4 million, but the Klan never became a dominant force in American politics, and it went into decline already in the late 1920s. The Roaring Twenties, after all, was a time of wage gains for the majority of American workers, by the end of which unemployment had fallen to little more than 3%. Relative gains were still important, to be sure. Some people could complain that they were not doing as well as others. Between 1920 and 1929, the income share of the top 1% rose still further. But I think the fact that most people were doing better in absolute terms by the end of the decade meant that economic dissatisfaction that translated into this form of political extremism was less than it would have been otherwise. The 1930s, of course, were radically different. Support for an open market-based economic system was undermined by the crisis, by the high unemployment and social distress caused by the Great Depression. The first casualty was the openness of the American economy to trade, which disappeared with the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930. More generally, a 25% unemployment rate like the US experienced in 1933 was fertile ground for populist extremists. The names of the most prominent extremists are well known, starting with Huey Long, who moved from the governorship of Louisiana to the US Senate in 1933. Having gone back and read some of Long's speeches recently, it's remarkable the extent to which his rhetoric and methods resemble those of one of the two candidates in the recent US campaign. Long himself said, quote, "I used to get things done by saying please, now I dynamite them out of my path." For political advice, he relied on his family and personal friends rather than political professionals. As one of his supporters put it, quote, "Others had power in their political organization, but Huey had power in himself." Long was a critic of the rich, of the banks, of the Federal Reserve System. He appealed to working class voters hit by the Depression with a Share Our Wealth program focused on, interesting contrast here, taxing the wealthy and redistributing the proceeds to the poor and the homeless in the manner perhaps of a guaranteed income program. His academic critics pointed out that the sums didn't add up, but details were not of the essence. So in 1933, Long broke with FDR on the grounds that the president's New Deal was too friendly to the banks and insufficiently redistributive. I think the reality was probably that the New Deal was simply too successful, or it looked like it was going to be too successful at placating Long's own constituency. Were it not discredited by rhetoric or other means, it would have been an obstacle to Long's plan of launching a primary challenge to FDR in 1936, in the event that primary challenge didn't happen because of assassin's bullet that killed Long shortly after he announced his national ambitions. I would remind you also that Long's leading surrogate was the new media expert, the radio preacher, Father Charles Coughlin of Royal Oak, Michigan. Coughlin was early to understand the power of new media, the power of the internet of the time, radio, to attract a national audience and mobilize a mass movement. So Coughlin had taken to radio innocently in the mid-1920s to protest the burning of crosses on the grounds of his church by the Klan. But by 1930, he was commenting widely on politics, advocating social and economic justice for the common man. Coughlin, like Long, had supported FDR in the 1932 campaign. He had supported the New Deal at its beginning in 1933, but by 1934 he turned against FDR as too accommodating of the money changers, code that will be familiar to you, and too willing to compromise. And after that, Coughlin lent his support to Long. Coughlin's increasingly radical proposals started with direct government control of the Federal Reserve System, and from there they veered into free silver, nationalizing the railroads, channeling a number of long-standing populist themes, together with guaranteed work and wealth redistribution through taxation. Coughlin praised Hitler and Mussolini for enlisting industry and banking in advancing those European leaders' national policy agendas, and from there it was a short step into anti-Semitic and neo-fascist rhetoric and advocating a foreign policy of neutrality toward Europe and isolationism for the United States. By 1934, then, Coughlin was reaching tens of millions of listeners weekly. I think, as in the case of radio and television hosts like Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity more recently, it's hard to pinpoint exactly his impact on American politics. By 1936, after 5 or 6 years of this, in any case, many voters had begun to turn against Coughlin and his advice, perhaps because of the extreme and erratic nature of his statements. But I think the other factor undercutting support for Coughlin's brand of populism, besides its erratic and intrinsically extreme nature, was, again, evidence that the political establishment was seeking to address the concerns of the insecure and excluded. FDR personally can be credited with fostering this impression. His "nothing to fear but fear itself" message spoke directly to the American people's heightened sense of insecurity, using language that people could understand. FDR's rhetoric was designed to show that he was allied with the common man, not with big business or finance. So this was a message that the new president sent in his inaugural address. Quote, "The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. The measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit. FDR's 1936 Madison Garden speech that secured his renomination. We had to, quote, "We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace, business and financial monopoly. They are now unanimous in their hatred for me, and I welcome their hatred." So FDR went extraordinary lengths to try to communicate on whose side he was, as it were. More concretely, I think Roosevelt's New Deal spoke to the concerns of those who had not shared in the prosperity of the 1920s and were hit hardest by the Depression of the 1930s. The Agricultural Adjustment Act addressed farmers' concern with low prices. The Wagner Act assured workers of adequate representation. It obliged firms to bargain with unions, those unions selected by the majority of workers. Unemployment insurance and Social Security addressed the insecurity of the masses in the difficult transition to the industrial age. It was called, after all, the Social Security Act, designed to address this perceived problem of insecurity. World War II then was followed by the expansion of the welfare state, of the social market economy, if you prefer, both in the US and elsewhere in the advanced country world. The share of the top 1% of the income distribution in the US, and that, for that matter, the share of the top 10% of the distribution was now significantly lower in the third quarter of the 20th century than it had been previously, due in part to increases in progressive taxation, a legacy of World War II. America's position as a global leader in manufacturing, reflecting the electrification and reorganization of factories in the 1920s and 1930s, and then wartime advances in mass production generated an abundance of well-paying manufacturing jobs. Sustained growth fostered a sense of economic opportunity and access to higher education, high school and university education, both through the GI Bill, worked to enhance socioeconomic mobility in this period. So in this favorable environment, US manufacturing firms understandably prioritized harmonious labor relations, which they sought to secure by sharing their profits, sharing their rents with their workers. Epitomizing this behavior was a famous 1950 contract, a 5-year labor agreement, the sort of which had never been seen before, between the United Auto Workers and General Motors, known as the Treaty of Detroit, which basically secured the peace for 5 years and provided workers not only with higher wages, a cost of living escalator, but employer protection, provided health care as well, and became the template for other such agreements. This then was the opposite in many ways of a promising economic climate for demagogues. I think, on the other hand, the international political situation and specifically the Cold War remained conducive, and in particular, they were conducive to the rise of Joseph McCarthy. So a long-standing interpretation of the rise of Senator McCarthy from Wisconsin sees him as not simply seeking to situate himself as the leading opponent of a foreign communist threat, and its fifth column. In addition, it portrays McCarthy as capitalizing on yet another revolt of the masses, this one driven by the status anxiety of white working-class Americans who feared losing their jobs and socioeconomic position to blacks who had migrated north and west during the war, and to other competing groups. So this view, in this view, it is argued that working-class whites were receptive to a kind of distorted mid-century populism championing nationalism and traditional values while ostracizing Jews, intellectuals, communist sympathizers, etc. Subsequent historical scholarship has not been entirely kind to this interpretation. I'm thinking of American historians like Michael Rogan, who looked carefully at who voted for McCarthy and established that working class Wisconsin voters were not, in fact, white working class Wisconsin voters were not, in fact, disproportionately inclined toward McCarthy. So status anxiety there may have been, but it didn't dominate American politics in this a period when inequality was falling and economic growth was basically lifting all boats. Again, there was concern with relative economic status, but it was less in a period when the absolute economic status of most families was rising. So in the end, McCarthy crashed and burned, and there were no more McCarthys to come on the American political scene. To be sure, Barry Goldwater asserted that extremism and the defense of freedom is no vice. Richard Nixon never entirely put his personal association or political habits, his personal association with McCarthy behind him, but I think it's fair to say that in this period, in the third quarter of the 20th century in the United States, the political center held. What then began to undermine the security and stability and support for the political center? I write here, historians disagree about when this consensus began to fray and the image of the United States as a land of opportunity, as inclusive, as a champion of free trade, and as a leader in achieving global peace and security began to tarnish. Some people would cite the trauma of the Vietnam War, America's troubled involvement in Iraq to explain growing opposition to immigration. Some people would emphasize 9/11 and Islamophobia. Others, slowing economic growth, rising inequality, and the stagnation of working class wages since 1970. I think history suggests a role for failed foreign interventions, for attacks on the homeland, for widening income inequality, and for slower economic growth all. But above all, it points to a role for insecurity, economic insecurity, and the sense of having been left behind. To my mind, the only surprise given this confluence of factors, some of which are of long standing, some of which have been operating forces underway since the 1970s. At a minimum, the only surprise is that it took so long for this populist reaction to materialize. That same history suggests at a general level how the political mainstream should respond to populists now seeking to capitalize on this sentiment. It suggests taking more seriously concerns about inequality and specifically the resentment and alienation of once privileged groups who feel left behind, proposals for a higher federal minimum wage, for a basic income, for more progressive income taxation all speak to those concerns, although clearly the affordability and political feasibility of those kind of proposals are now very much in doubt. President-elect Trump campaigned on a promise to achieve significantly faster rate of economic growth through a combination of deregulation, investment-friendly tax cuts, and a new program of infrastructure spending, along with, he would hope, more growth-friendly Federal Reserve policies. Trump promised to address complaints about inequality and economic exclusion by easing the way for small business, limiting the competition for jobs from immigrants, and using a more aggressive trade policy to bring back good, high-paying manufacturing jobs to the United States. in the past, achieving a faster rate of economic growth and sharing the benefits more widely, often through direct government intervention in the economy, have been a successful way of beating back the populist turn in American politics. So if my lecture tonight has a simple message, that's it. But to conclude, whether the new president's policies will succeed this time in delivering these results is, at best, uncertain. I, for one, have my doubts. I think there is a significant disconnect here between the means and the ends. And if there really is a significant disconnect between the means and the ends, then the next populist, then this populist reaction is not over. And one shudders to imagine the form that the next one could take. So on that happy note, let me conclude. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for your talk. We now have time for questions. And we have a young lady with a microphone, because we have other guests sitting in the library. Please use the microphone when you ask a short and precise question. And no statement, please. The statement is by the speaker. So, we invite questions.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, a survey course in American economic history in a very short period of time, but very elegantly done. Just one quick factual point. Was it the case that they had the primary system back in the 1930s? Wouldn't that have been, men in a smoke-filled room in a convention? That's just a factual question with Huey Long running a primary campaign against FDR. If you want to answer that one quickly, go ahead.
So, sure, the nature of the nomination process was quite different than it is now, fine. But it's not clear that the men in the smoke-filled room would have been unresponsive to...
Okay, I understand. I just wanted to ask that. Here's the form of the question. Given the prospect of the chaos that Trump can bring to the country and the world, would you support, I'm going to try to make this very short, the Democrats going all out in now trying to throw this into turmoil by claiming the election was rigged through the Russians, among other people, and being able to make a very strong circumstantial case that that happened?
I think that question strays dangerously close to your statement territory. I think there are many things in American history, aspects of American institutions that I would change. Many people are talking about the Electoral College, for example, as an archaic institution that may have outlived its time and caused more problems than it solves. But I also think that history does not run in reverse, and that the outcome of this election has been decided, and that people who want to work for different policies and different political outcomes are forced to do that, taking this election as a fait accompli. It has happened, and there's not going to be a revote. We do need to understand going forward what the role of these of different economic, political, and social forces inside the United States in shaping this electoral outcome, which surprised many of us, surprised the experts, surprised the elites present. And in that context, it's important to understand also if there is what was a role played by foreign factors, foreign forces, foreign governments. I'm not in a position to answer that question. I'm happy that there is going to be more scrutiny of that question, at least for the next month and a half.
If I may ask you, in view of your original talk on the survival of the euro, whether you might venture into suggesting that the euro has been causing problems, encouraging populists in Europe, especially in the Mediterranean countries.
I should preface my answer by recalling, since not everybody present or viewing in the future will know, that I was originally going to come here to Berlin and speak tonight about the euro, but other events have intervened in our world, and I felt compelled to try to understand a little bit better what was happening in place in context, and as an academic, the way I do that is by writing and speaking. So that's what led me to suggest this topic instead tonight. To come to your question, yes, I do think that the euro has been a force contributing to imbalances in Europe, prosperity in Germany, coinciding with depression in Greece and elsewhere at the euro area periphery, with all the tensions attendant on that. I think the euro also is a demonstration of my earlier point that history does not run in reverse. And sometimes when critical decisions are made, only by the slightest of margins, we have to figure out how to live them and within the constraints that they impose, work for a better world. So I think there's absolutely no question that going ahead with the euro in 1999 was premature, that going ahead with the euro in 1999 was a mistake, because monetary union without banking union, fiscal union, and political union won't work. The strategy of trying to use monetary union to force the pace of fiscal union, banking union, and political union could backfire, and it did, in fact, do so that the euro has made the prospects for political integration in Europe more remote, not more immediate, because of the problems it has thrown up in Europe and the tension it has created between the different member states. But I view the euro in the same way that I view Trump's victory in the election. From a personal point of view, from an analytical point of view, I'm not sure I can really distinguish those two from one another. I regard both of them as regrettable, but I regard both of them as facts that we now have to deal with. So I think in the context of the euro area, you had Professor Stiglitz here a month or two ago. I would agree with much of his retrospective diagnosis of the nature of the problems created by the euro, but then I would disagree fundamentally with him about what the prospects are going forward, that there is no backing out of the euro at this point any more than there is the possibility of rerunning the US election, that it is a fact, and trying to break it up would cause the mother of all financial crises. It's an interesting analytical exercise to imagine US policies under a Hillary Clinton administration, and it's similarly interesting to imagine counterfactually how a Europe with a Northern European euro and a Southern European euro would work. But you can't get from here to there. There is no way politically, economically, and financially to navigate that transition without falling into the catastrophic chasm that divides here from there. So I see really only, if there are three scenarios for the euro area, one is going back to national currencies or going back to separate currencies for Northern and Southern Europe. That is simply not feasible, absent a catastrophic crisis, a price you would not want to pay to materialize that scenario. Scenario number two is the status quo, which is more comfortable in Germany, more comfortable in Berlin than it is in much of the rest of Europe. But I think what we've learned is that Europe has enough of a social market economy, enough of a safety net in most European countries that people can tolerate more pain from a dysfunctional monetary arrangement than we would have thought. People have been predicting the demise of the euro now for 7, 8, 9 years, and it's still here. So I think one scenario is 7, 8, or 9 years, we will still be having this conversation. And the more optimistic way is that Europe figures out a way to move forward to integrate fiscally, to complete its banking union, and to create institutions of governance sufficient to make all that possible. Not fiscal banking and monetary union, but further in that direction. And here maybe there is a place where Mr. Trump will have a salutary influence. Europeans are beginning to understand that they now have to hang separately, hang together, or they will hang separately, because the U.S. will not, you know, the U.S. and NATO may not be a reliable, we hope it will be a reliable ally, but we can't be certain. So that will provide new impetus for European integration, and the question is whether you can capitalize on it or not.
There's a gentleman right here.
So I'm wondering about the extent to which you think the disconnect that you perceive in Trump's policies extend into his electorate itself. And I'm thinking of the whole idea of the blue-collar billionaire. And the idea now that's been talked about a great deal after the election that the white working class admire the rich and hate professionals, and they see them as the bane of their existence. And yet the policies that Trump may actually pursue, now it depends, I mean, we may get the infrastructure spending, though it might be more public-private partnerships that don't end up building or rebuilding the 60,000 bridges that we actually need to see rebuilt. But to what extent is there an idea or a political cultural sort of current that has taken hold in the United States that opened the door for this kind of connection between a kind of oligarchical elite and an electorate that seemed open to these appeals? Relatedly, what then is the role of ideas or political culture generally in relation to the kinds of economic insecurities that you've stressed in the narrative that you've spelled out?
So we have had certainly surprises already in terms of the composition of Trump's cabinet and advisors. That, so far as I can tell, I should clearly be watching more alternative media than I do, but so far as I can tell, have not elicited a negative reaction yet from Trump supporters. So there is this view.
One story in Breitbart against the Labor nominee.
So there is the view that the businessmen with which Trump, the billionaires with which Trump is surrounding himself, are going to bring prosperity and manufacturing jobs back to the United States. Consistent with the implication of your question, I don't think that the economic policies on offer will obviously, they will not do that. The infrastructure initiative will be smaller than everyone thinks because it will have to pass through a Congress where traditional Republican opposition to debt and deficits is strong. I think the one thing the president will be able to do is move on his own without congressional support on the protectionist front, and that's not going to bring back jobs that have been automated out of existence rather than outsourced out of existence. But I think the question that we don't know how to answer is whether actual results really will matter for the political support for Mr. Trump, or whether it's image or reality that will be important.
Thank you very much. I have a question as well. I'm wondering, I understand why people who have economic anxiety would vote for a populist candidate. What I don't understand is why so many evangelicals voted for a populist candidate, more than perhaps any voted for any other Republican candidate, 81%. That's 9% more than voted for Romney. Can you explain why this is the case?
No, but I'm happy to take your ideas seriously. Seriously.
Okay, the lady in red.
Thank you, and I enjoyed your talk very much. I have a question about the election campaign and if there was not a violation of the rule of law. And what I'm talking about is, if, for example, we do know, or it was speculation, that the Russians intervened in the WikiLeaks, publication of Hillary Clinton's emails, and if that had been known, would there not have been a question on the Department of Justice to intervene at that moment and said there is a violation of rule of law and even a violation of national security? So this is pre-election, not after the election. Was there not a way to intervene in that process, knowing what was already known at that time, and particularly what we know today?
I'm not sure. Your question takes me far away from my economic comfort zone. I do think that any such intervention would have been regarded as highly partisan. So for what you might have regarded as an announcement of the existence of violation of rule of law would have been perceived in other circles as a biased partisan intervention on behalf of one candidate relative to the other. You know, to repeat what I said before, I think there are, it's important to get to the bottom of this set of questions in order to defend and preserve the integrity of the American electoral system and political system more broadly, but that is not going to change the identity of the U.S. president in the next 4 years.
Gentleman right here, and the next one is up in the back.
All right, thank you very much for this tour de force through American history. I have a simple question. I mean, so in all these, the issue of social security looms large, and also recently we had a very large financial crisis that probably also plays a part. My question is, I've recently heard this idea that maybe to some extent you can consider the availability of credit through credit cards and also easily available mortgage as a substitute for social welfare state, right? So that maybe the fact that in a way also new technology made credit to a very large part of the especially American population available might have acted as sort of a dampening force, taking away some of the pressure of buying time, so to speak, as a substitute for sort of proper welfare system, which is now exploding.
I certainly think there's a connection, an important connection between the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 and these subsequent political trends. And again, the surprise to my mind is it took so long for that connection to become evident. There is a lot of historical evidence from different countries at different times that all points in the same direction, that deep recessions that are associated with financial crises, that result from financial crises, have more polarizing effects on electorates than equally deep recessions that don't have this prominent financial component. Typically, government has to intervene to staunch the financial bleeding through rescues, through bailouts that are perceived, rightly or wrongly, as coming at taxpayer expense. And that, as you well know, is a polarizing influence as well. In terms of the causes of the financial crisis, I do agree. There's careful research that does seem to substantiate the view that because inequality was rising in the United States and blue-collar working-class living standards were stagnating, there was both an increased demand for credit by the households in question in order to keep up with their neighbors who were doing better, and a willingness of regulators and their political masters to further liberalize the financial markets in order to make that credit more freely available. So this is yet another channel through which the growth of inequality, if you will, the problem of secular stagnation, contributed via the channel of the financial crisis to the political polarization that followed.
Gentleman, Jessica? Gentleman right there. Okay, or ladies first. Okay, we go ladies first.
Thanks. Hi, I have a question. In your analysis of the historical analysis of populism, there's always been sort of space for counter movements to emerge to sort of rein in the excess, what might be sort of the most excessive movements that might emerge out of populism. So I'm wondering if you could apply that same analysis to the present moment and say, in your conclusion that Trump's prescriptions are not likely to work, in that, if that's your assumption, then where might we look for the spaces in the current moment for an effective counter movement to the sort of worst case scenario that you concluded on of where things might go?
So I do worry that there are these two possibilities. If Trump fails to bring good manufacturing jobs back to the United States and his supporters grow disaffected, they can move back to the center, or they can move even more to the extremes, both left and right, but in particular further to the right. What can mainstream politicians do to increase the likelihood that they will be the beneficiaries of these disaffected Trump voters? There was an earlier question about the importance of ideas, and again, I'm kind of speaking my own book. I'm in the ideas business, but I think to better articulate a set of policies and a platform that can deliver that the promised economic result ought to make a big difference. I think Clinton ran a better campaign than she is now credited with in the current environment. But her economic policies were pretty cut and dry, pretty predictable, old line democratic economic policies. Her advisors were the same old guys and girls. So I think the political center, the political left of center, if you will, has to think about how do you do industrial policy in the 21st century? How do you do technology policy in the 21st century? We have been cutting spending, talking my own book once again, on public higher education in the United States. Is there a smart way to deliver higher education more efficiently than we have in the past? We now have 4 years to have that debate.
Jessica, there's a gentleman right in front. Okay. Not master of the microphone.
I would like to ask you concerning left-wing populism. From our perspective in Germany, Mr. Sanders would probably be considered a moderate social democrat, although his rhetoric is much more forceful. How would you consider his economic policies? Would that be populism to you?
So I think your characterization of Sanders is correct. that he is not a flaming left-wing radical at this stage of his life. This is a very old question that I can't shed additional light on. It's the why is there no socialism in the United States question, if you will. And again, I think there is a failure on the left in the United States to articulate clearly, the way an economist would put it, is where the market failures are, exactly, creating a strategic case for government intervention there. And depending on how widespread the market failures are, you might want more comprehensive, more radical government intervention. But I think again, the failure in the United States is not the absence of a viable far-left party or movement, but simply a failure on the left adequately rethink the role for government and build it up from first principles.
Okay, I think we have... Jessica, can you hear me? Excellent. We have a gentleman here, and when I point... That's him. Second row. Right there. Excellent. Thank you so much. And then I think after that we have time for 2 more questions. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Okay. I happen to have 2 gentlemen sitting right here who... Is that correct? Did the 2 of you want to ask? Or do we... Okay, so we have 1 question. The lady over there. Okay, so it's all set. You're first, second gentleman here, lady last. That's it. Okay, thank you.
I'll try to make it very brief and short. In analogy to the 30s, where eventually the New Deal issue ended up in possibly failing, and without the Second World War breaking out, perhaps the whole stimulus package that Roosevelt had at the time wouldn't have come to a positive end in economic terms internally within the United States. If you would draw this parallel today, would it mean that perhaps we're standing in some sort of another 30s scenario that perhaps a remilitarization, a stimulus package in the military sector, bringing lots of jobs to the United States that eventually, due to security issues, of course have to be on the soil of the United States and not abroad. Could this perhaps stem a stimulus similar to the 30s and eventually lead to whatever growth?
I would like to be able to answer your question no, no, and no. That military buildup is not the way to create jobs in the United States. The military is probably the highest tech of the high-tech sectors, along with certain parts of information technology. I would disagree with the way you characterized the 1930s, that the US economy was growing by 10% per annum between 1933 and 1937. When you start from a 25% unemployment rate and then you have a double-dip recession in 1937-38 because the Fed moves too quickly to raise interest rates, you still need World War II to restore full employment. But the New Deal was a relatively small thing in terms of fiscal stimulus, but I think it was a big thing in terms of institutional change in creating the modern welfare state of a sort capable of dealing with that insecurity problem.
Thank you. Analysts have pointed to the fact that over the last 30 years, less and less legislation in the US Congress has been bipartisan. So the degree to which laws have no longer been voted by larger majorities, but at the end, and we have seen this in the Obama administration, had to push through in sort of very tough and partisan ways. Is that also part of the bigger picture of what you describe the economic distribution issue, or isn't that also, and maybe even much more so, indicative of a genuine political, but maybe also cultural fragmentation of the US and the US governance system?
I think everything you say is is accurate. And in addition, it's important to point to congressional redistricting, gerrymandering, as creating safe districts on both sides of the aisle that limit political competition and limit the incentive for politicians to move toward the center because they have someone running against them who poses a real threat. In California, we have now created, through a popular referendum decision, an independent congressional district, congressional redistricting commission made up of people from the two sides, largely independent of politics. So it can be done. The problem is here again, progress such as it is slow. Congressional districts are redrawn only every 10 years when we have a new census of population. So if there's going to be progress creating more sensible congressional districts, or at least not aggravating this problem further, other states are going to have to do the same thing, and we are going to have to be very patient.
That's the last question I
Thank you. I would agree with you that, that the economic factor is a very important part of the explanation, but I was wondering if maybe the populist dynamic itself is a little bit more complex, and I have two questions that relate to that. One is that, for example, the Labour campaign in the Brexit voting was heavily criticized for running on an economic platform. So maybe there was something wrong with the campaign, but in general it was said that they should have been more political, a lot more political in reaching out to their constituencies. And then the other part of my question pertains to the solutions that you offered. I wondered that now with that globalization and the global connectedness of economies, and also kind of changes or limits the solutions, the possible economic solutions that were available in the, 20 or 30 years ago, but that might not be so readily available now, like protectionism, kind of investing in manufacturing and infrastructure. So, yeah.
Well, I certainly do agree that globalization is deeply embedded here now in 2016. I wouldn't rule out the idea that a politician like Donald Trump could significantly disrupt its operation and erect significant tariff barriers against imports into the United States. I did suggest earlier, and I'll say now explicitly, I think there would be very high costs to the U.S. economy, to U.S. firms who that depend on imported inputs that would suffer from foreign retaliation, were the new U.S. administration to go down that road. So I don't think I think that politics could disrupt the current global system, and I in all honesty, I should say the same thing about the euro. That the argument I made about the euro, if you will recall, was fundamentally an economic argument as well. That holding the euro together will be costly, but economically breaking it up would be even more costly. So I've used that logic for a long time to inform my view that the euro is here to stay, because the economic costs of breaking it up would exceed the economic costs of holding it together. The point being that politicians don't always take decisions on the basis of that kind of calculus, and Mr. Trump may yet provide us with a very clear example of the contrary. I recall that I was at a conference on Brexit at Ditchley Park in the UK on November 4th and 5th, 4 days before the US election. I recall because we were trying to sort out the relative importance of economic factors, insecurity, nativism, the feeling of loss of control to Brussels in why the UK had voted to leave. None of the assembled wise men and women had any idea of what would happen in the United States the next Tuesday.
Let me, at this point, thank you very much for your presentation.